The Age of Enlightenment began in Europe in the late 17th century. It would bring about fundamental changes in the way the world was understood and how societies were organized. Until then, the Church had dictated what to think and how to live. Dissent was punished, even by death. But with the Enlightenment, people began to embrace new ideas about freedom of expression and new rational methods to investigate the world. In England, Newton laid the foundations of science as we know it by showing that the universe was governed by physical laws that could be discovered using observation and reason. In philosophy, Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot argued that man, not God, was at the center of the world. Ideas were beginning to change, but in the 18th century, most of Europe was still in thrall to absolute monarchs. Empowered by Enlightenment thinking in both Europe and America, people began to demand real change. How would their rulers respond? How would society move forward? This is the story of three very different men who tried to put the ideas of the Enlightenment into practice. In France, Condorcet, a mathematician and philosopher at the center of the French Revolution. In America, the lawyer and congressman Thomas Jefferson, principal author of the Declaration of Independence, the blueprint for the first new republic of modern times. And in Prussia, the king himself, Frederick the Great, an enlightened but ruthless monarch. This is the palace of Sans-Souci in Potsdam, Germany, near Berlin. It's here that Frederick the Great held court for nearly half a century. His was a fabulous palace, in which the architecture, the symbols of the sun, the geometric order, were all specifically designed to embody Enlightenment ideals. As a crown prince, Frederick dreamed of building such a place. He had no interest in the affairs of state and would spend time reading the poetry and philosophy of the Enlightenment thinkers. He was a man of formidable intellect. But his country, Prussia, didn't match his ambitions. It was just a few poor and scattered territories. When he became king in 1740, he was determined to make Prussia into a great power. In Frederick, Enlightenment beliefs coexisted with ruthless ambition. The grandeur of Sans-Souci's architecture demonstrates these two sides of his character.
Wir sind hier im Marmorsaal von Schloss Sans-Souci, dem größten und auch dem prächtigsten Raum. Dieses Pantheon, wie wir sehen, geht in den Himmel hinaus. Das Licht kommt ganz gleichmäßig in den Raum. Das Licht, das gleichzeitig eine sehr symbolträchtige Bedeutung in der Aufklärung hatte, weil es ja nach dem Mittelalter sozusagen den Menschen die Aufklärung, die Vernunft, die Wahrheit bringen sollte.
To Sans-Souci, Frederick invited some of the most brilliant philosophers, mathematicians, painters and musicians from all over Europe. Here in the Marble Room, they discussed the very latest ideas, and Frederick himself was often seen impressing his guests with his own musical compositions. He composed more than 100 sonatas and 4 symphonies. One of the guests at Frederick's court was the French philosopher and writer Voltaire, the best-known Enlightenment figure of the day. Frederick had been corresponding with Voltaire for many years. He needed Voltaire's intelligence and inspiration. Voltaire, often in exile, needed Frederick's protection and support for his radical ideas. Together they wrote a manifesto for the perfect Enlightenment ruler. It's called the Anti-Machiavel.
Der Anti-Machiavel, geschrieben im letzten Kronprinzenjahr Friedrichs, ist Ergebnis einer langen Diskussion zwischen Voltaire und Friedrich. Sie haben sich ihre Gedanken ausgetauscht über Fürstenwillkür und wie ein Monarch, wie ein Regent regieren sollte. Aber man kann den Anti-Machiavel durchaus als sein Regierungsprogramm, als sein vorab abgefasstes Regierungsprogramm sehen und verstehen.
The object of a truly enlightened monarch, as set out in the Anti-Machiavel, is to do his subjects infinite good. Frederick wanted to achieve that, but he wanted, as an absolute monarch, to do it on his terms. Enlightenment thinkers thought they found such rulers in China, a sophisticated and much older civilization. That country fascinated both Voltaire and Frederick. They learned about China through accounts from European missionaries and traders, and from the exotic Chinese artifacts flooding into Europe at that time. To show his enthusiasm for China, Frederick built this elaborate pavilion in the grounds of Sanssouci in 1750.
Die ganze Idee, was China so ideal macht, eben als harmonische, friedliche Gesellschaft, das drückt sich an dem Gebäude aus, eines Lebens im Freien, in Harmonie. Alle trinken gemeinsam Tee, machen Musik und es gibt eigentlich keine Probleme.
To Frederick, China was ruled by emperors steeped in the ideas of the philosopher Confucius. Confucius emphasized the importance of reason, wisdom, benevolence, and meritocracy, ideas Frederick was anxious to embody.
Auf dem Gebäude sitzt eine Figur, die sehr rätselhaft ist. Man kann ihn einerseits als Konfuzius interpretieren. Das ist natürlich der große Philosoph Chinas, der diese Staatsphilosophie, und das ist sicherlich ein Vorbild für Friedrich gewesen, der sich selber ja als der Philosophenkönig auch gesehen hat. Und ich denke, der Hauptpunkt war auch nicht wirklich die Nutzung des Gebäudes, sondern die Imagewirkung. Ganz Europa hat es gesehen, darüber geredet, Kupferstiche davon angefertigt. Also es ging, glaube ich, hauptsächlich um die Botschaft dahinter.
The pavilion helped to build Frederick's reputation abroad. But the reality of his situation was far from imperial. Prussia was only one of 300 small German states. In order to make it into an international power, he needed to expand its territory by going to war on his neighbours. Here the ruthless ambition of his character came into play. Needing a massive army to achieve his goal, he decreed that every boy must be registered at birth for military service, and every able-bodied man must sign up. At any time, 1 in 20 of the population was a soldier. They filled Prussia's towns and villages.
Für die Soldaten benötigte er sehr, sehr viele Unterkünfte. Und so machte er es seinen Bürgern zur Auflage, in den Häusern, in denen sie wohnten, in den Städten, Zimmer bereitzustellen, in denen er jederzeit diese Soldaten einquartieren konnte. Das hieß, dass die Soldaten ständig präsent waren im zivilen Leben der preußischen Städte.
But as fast as they were built, the quarters were emptied again by casualties. Even now, Frederick is remembered as a ruthless commander who sacrificed his soldiers heedlessly.
Er setzte seine Soldaten wie Menschenmaterial ein, nutzte sie als Kanonenfutter und warf sie an den Stellen in die Schlacht, wo er sie benötigte. Das führte zu teilweise unglaublichen Verlusten. Es kam vor, dass am Ende eines Kampftages über 30.000 Soldaten den Tod fanden.
So Frederick always needed more men, and he realized that every one he recruited from Prussia would empty the towns and villages and weaken his own economy. But every one he could recruit from abroad would weaken his enemies. So he sent his officers out with enticing promises for those who signed up.
Man sieht hier wenn man nicht so genau das Kleingedruckte liest, was er ihnen versprach. Dienst mit der Waffe zur Ehre des Vaterlandes, gutes Geld, was sie verdienen konnten und nicht zu vergessen auch einige Freuden, die das Soldatenleben mit sich brachten.
Frederick, who made a habit of inspecting his troops before breakfast, specified exactly the kind of man who would make an effective soldier.
Friedrich fand es wichtig, es war eigentlich unverzichtbar, solche Soldaten anzuwerben, die ein gewisses Körpermaß, eine Länge aufwiesen, um die Gewehre richtig laden zu können. Und sie mussten ihre Zähne, oder zumindest einige von den Zähnen, noch im Mund haben. Denn die Papierhülsen, mit denen sie ausgestattet waren, mit Pulver gefüllte Papierhülsen, die mussten zerbissen werden.
Frederick's army became the largest in Europe.
Es ist dann gesagt worden, dass Preußen ab einem bestimmten Zeitpunkt nicht mehr ein Staat war, der sich Soldaten leistete, sondern dass Preußen aus Soldaten bestand, die über einen Staat verfügten.
His master plan for imperial expansion was working out. But to house and feed this vast army, much more land was needed. So he sent his soldiers into battle again, but this time within his own borders and against nature. He set about turning the vast and largely uninhabited Oder marshes into cultivated land. The Enlightenment believed that science and technology could be used not just to understand nature, but to tame and improve it.
Also versuchte er mit Hilfe der modernen aufgeklärten Wissenschaft und mit Hilfe von Experten, die in Berlin an der Akademie der Wissenschaften unterrichteten, Wege zu finden, um dieses Gebiet trockenzulegen. Der Trick war, einen Abschnitt der Oder zu verkürzen, mit Hilfe eines Kanals, der gegraben wurde. Dadurch wurde eine Länge des Flusses von 25 Kilometern eingespart.
The work was dangerous, not least because the swamps were malarial. But in peace as in war, Frederick's soldiers had no choice. It took 30 years, but finally it was done. Enlightenment reason prevailed. New villages were built alongside fast new roads. And the traditional fishing villages were replaced with neat rows of houses, flourishing crops and livestock. Frederick's vision of utopia.
Im Schlamm, im Morast, Aale, Krebse und Fische gründelten, konnten die Kolonisten nun in Reih und Glied. Am Ende seiner Tage konnte Friedrich also sagen, dass er diesen Feind wirklich besiegt hatte. Die Natur war erobert, gezähmt und kultiviert.
1,200 new villages welcomed 300,000 settlers, not just from Prussia, but also abroad. Many of the settlers were religious refugees, Catholics, Jews and others who were persecuted in neighbouring states. But they were welcome here. Frederick's most extraordinary quality for a monarch of that time was his religious tolerance, an important element of Enlightenment philosophy. He said, each man must aim for salvation in his own way.
Friedrich wollte nun diese religiöse Vielfalt noch erweitern. Gleich in seinem ersten Regierungsjahr ließ er verlautbaren, dass alle Religionen in Preußen gewünscht sein würden und hier solle jeder nach seiner Fasson selig werden.
A great ruler needed to demonstrate this with a great deed. Prussia was a Protestant state, and yet Frederick built this magnificent Catholic cathedral in the heart of his capital.
Und tatsächlich versprach er allen preußischen Katholiken, dass auch sie sich nun im Herzen Berlins eine Kirche bauen lassen, so groß und so prächtig, wie sie immer nur haben möchten. Insofern ist diese Kathedrale nicht nur der Beweis, dass die Katholiken in Preußen wohlgelitten sind, sondern sie strahlt wirklich hinaus nach Berlin die Botschaft, dass alle Religionen hier in Preußen zu Hause sein können.
Building this cathedral was a gesture unparalleled in the Europe of that time. By now, he'd realized most of his ambitions. He doubled the size of Prussia, and turned it from one small state among many into a major European power. Frederick had indeed become great. And to demonstrate this, 20 years after Sanssouci, he built himself a new and very different palace. In the palace's grand private theatre, Frederick and his court enjoyed the latest plays, including those of his friend and collaborator, Voltaire.
Denn wenn man sich das Repertoire hier im Theater anguckt, wenn man schaut, was hier gespielt wurde, sieht man, dass viele Stücke von Voltaire aufgeführt wurden, gesellschaftskritische Stücke.
But when Prussia itself became the target of Voltaire's pen, it was too much for Frederick. The one freedom he wouldn't contemplate was a free press.
Kritik an der Kirche? Ja. Gesellschaftliche Veränderungen? Ja, auch ein wenig, aber nicht so weit, dass Friedrich selbst hätte gefährdet werden können. Denn dann wäre all das, was er getan hat für seine Größe, wenn man so will, umsonst gewesen.
Think whatever you like, but obey, was Frederick's message to his people. Voltaire's continuing defiance eventually forced him to flee from Sanssouci for good. Frederick wasn't going to risk any further damage to his reputation. He made sure that the only portrait his people saw of him was this one, as a simple, hard-working soldier in a blue coat. To this day, this image is still immediately recognized. Frederick was a monarch of his time and place. He admired the ideas of enlightenment, but not the individual liberty they implied. He allowed freedom of worship, but not freedom of the press. He improved the lives of his people, but sacrificed them ruthlessly in battle. The Enlightenment came to Prussia, but on his terms. And this complexity is perfectly summed up in the grave he designed for himself at Sanssouci. It's a plain stone slab for a simple soldier, a practical man of reason. But on it are carved the words he chose from the start: Frederick the Great. On the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, a brand new country was about to put Enlightenment ideas into practice, but in a very different way. And at the heart of what would be an extraordinary and radical social experiment was this young Virginian lawyer and politician, Thomas Jefferson. 18th century America, where Jefferson grew up and was educated, was made up of 13 British colonies. 2 centuries earlier, settlers from Europe had started to arrive, many bringing radical ideas. They'd created a thriving rural economy, exporting crops of tobacco and wheat back to Europe. It was a land of opportunity. Here in Virginia was the plantation Jefferson inherited from his father. At its heart is Monticello, a beautiful mansion designed by Jefferson himself. Based on his study of neoclassical architecture, symbolic to him of enlightenment, reason, and harmony.
This is the entrance hall at Monticello, and anybody who would come into this room would get a glimpse into the mind of Thomas Jefferson. And this was an enlightened mind, a very self-consciously enlightened mind. It's a kind of cabinet of curiosities. Jefferson is creating an enlightenment arena, a domain in which people can share in the illumination of his world. Jefferson had been to Europe, and he brought back 80 crates full of things. This is the famous clock, which is the latest in modern technology. The clock was the epitome of Enlightenment mechanics. This ingenuity, this precision is something that moves Jefferson. It's very much his idea of how the world moves with that precision according to natural law. That you could capture in some way, mimic the world, was the great project of the Enlightenment. Once you understood the world, you could improve the world. His great heroes were Bacon, Newton, and Locke, the great triumvirate who changed the way people saw the world. And it was Locke who built on the foundation of the new science to suggest a science of man, a science of politics. And this was the excitement of Jefferson's era in America, was the first great opportunity to apply the fundamental precepts of the Enlightenment to the organization of human society.
The ideas of the British philosopher John Locke were crucial in Jefferson's thinking. His key thought was that every individual has basic rights which are not given but are inherent from birth. According to Locke, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. In 1776, Jefferson had a unique chance to turn these principles into reality. It all started with a revolt by the American colonists against increasingly heavy taxes imposed by the British. Before long, the tax revolt became a political revolt. Influenced by the European Enlightenment, Jefferson and his comrades began to argue for independence. In July 1776, in the face of Britain, the most powerful enemy in the world at the time, they created a rebel parliament. Jefferson, who was only 33 years old, was asked to draft the Declaration of Independence.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That powerful language in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, that is the fundamental premise of his political philosophy. We have a new notion of self-sovereignty. A power comes out of the individual, and individuals working together could create unprecedented power and opportunity for human flourishing.
Jefferson imagined his new country as a community of free citizens, unlike any other nation of the time. As his hero John Locke had proposed, the right to own property would be crucial. Now Jefferson expanded on this idea.
John Locke wrote about life, liberty, and property in his second treatise on government. Jefferson used almost the same language in the Declaration, but he substituted happiness for property. And the idea is that if you own land, you are beyond the influence and control of others. Property ownership was a means to an end, and the end was human flourishing. That's what we mean by the pursuit of happiness.
How would these rights of life, liberty, and happiness be guaranteed? What form of government would the colonists now choose for their new country? having finally won its War of Independence from Britain in 1783, their new task was to design a constitution.
The challenge for the framers of the Constitution was to construct a new regime which would preserve the sovereignty of the people, an elaborate mechanism that would preserve liberty and the rule of law.
Their first decision was that their country would be a republic, the first new republic in modern history. There would be no king, no emperor. Instead, America would be headed by an elected president, whose residence would be the White House. At the Congress, there'd be elected representatives from each of the states of the Union. The third branch of the government, the Supreme Court, housed here, is made up of the country's most senior judges. This separation of powers reflected Jefferson's concern to prevent excessive control by any single branch of government. It was embodied in the design of the country's new capital city, Washington, which he oversaw.
The three branches were separated both theoretically and practically and geographically. They're located in different spots in this city. You could even see the American Constitution if you looked down on the city and saw the map, and you'd see the separate locations of the different branches. The various component parts of the system would offset each other, would balance and check each other. This elaborate system is a quintessential product of the Enlightenment.
Among Washington's many grand monuments today is this one, to Jefferson. In 1801, he'd become the third president of the United States of America. Carved here on the walls is his Declaration of Independence, inspired by the Enlightenment. Facing the famous inscription about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are his lofty words about slavery. Nothing is more certainly written in the Book of Fate than that these people are to be free. But there is a serious limitation in Jefferson's thinking that marks him out as a man not of our time, but of his. Crucially left out of this quote is the second half of his sentence. The two races, equally free, cannot live under the same government. Nowhere was Jefferson's attitude to black Americans clearer than on his own plantation at Monticello. The clue lies in his famous clock. Unlike the elaborate face inside the house, the one on the outside has only one hand. It was for his slaves. Monticello was a slave plantation.
Monticello depended upon slavery. During the course of Jefferson's life, he owned upwards of 700 people. At one time, there may be 200 enslaved people here on the mountain, and they did everything from the agricultural work to building the house. So it was entwined with the culture totally.
Not only did Jefferson own slaves, but in his personal beliefs, he displayed deep prejudice. He believed that black people could never be the equal of whites.
Jefferson believed that blacks were inferior because he was watching blacks who were uneducated, the people in his immediate vicinity, the people who worked on his farms, didn't show him, he thought, and according to him, a sort of spark of intellectual curiosity that he thought that white people possessed.
How could a man who'd enshrined equality, liberty, and freedom as the fundamental principles for America deny them to black people? In Jefferson's time, 1 in 5 Americans was a slave, working on the vast plantations owned by white farmers. They were regarded as legitimate property. Their owners had the right to punish them as they liked, even to kill them without penalty.
One of the things that he said when he was discussing the future is that whites would never give up their prejudices against blacks, and blacks would never forgive white people for what they had done to them. And so he saw nothing but the possibility of conflict if there was emancipation.
The conflict did come 70 years later, in the bloody Civil War that tore America apart and left African Americans struggling to assert themselves for generations to come. Towards the end of his life, Jefferson founded this famous institution, the University of Virginia, as a lasting embodiment of his ideals. Its purpose was to provide the Republic with enlightened leaders. In his time, this university was only for the white male elite. Today, men and women of all classes and colours are graduating here, a vindication in the end of Jefferson's belief that education would guarantee the success of the Republic. Following America's victory in its War of Independence, Jefferson came to France, Britain's arch-enemy, to raise money and support for his young republic. France could not have been more different from its new ally, America. Here at the Palace of Versailles near Paris lived the French king, Louis XVI, the most absolute monarch in Europe. With no interest in Enlightenment ideas, he and his courtiers lived in total luxury.
Versailles was the centre of government for the whole kingdom. 10,000 people lived in this palace. It was incredibly expensive to run. This very room we're in took 800 candles to light every night. Running the royal court took 5% of the king's annual revenue. And yet the king had 3 more palaces nearly this size, and in 1785 he brought another one for his wife. Given the state of the royal finances, this was a situation that could not continue.
Louis XVI's support for the Americans against the British had placed additional strain on the king's finance, but it was a source of French pride. These paintings were commissioned by the French court to celebrate Britain's defeat by America with French help. The women of Versailles showed support in their own way.
And one of the ways that the women of court chose to endorse this policy was by making these grand poof hairdos, often including ships that the French Navy was sending over to America. Even though they were trying to support the American cause, the ostentation of feathers and ships in hairstyles couldn't hold up to the living example of the American ministers.
The American revolutionaries in Paris dressed simply and spoke plainly. Their values were beginning to make a huge impact on French intellectuals.
The French really seized on Jefferson, and it is because of this enlightened philosophical standpoint that he also became a kind of living emblem for the French of the virtues of the new American Republic.
Here at Palais Royal, the intellectual hub of Paris, Jefferson would regularly meet this man, Condorcet, a mathematician, a nobleman, and a passionate advocate of Enlightenment ideas. He would exert a great influence on the tumultuous events about to erupt in France.
Il est convaincu que les sciences morales et politiques doivent être conçues dans un même esprit de révolution scientifique. Et sa particularité, c'est qu'il comprend qu'une question fondamentale, c'est le rôle des mathématiques dans cette affaire.
One of Condorcet's favourite haunts was this restaurant, Le Procope, where Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot would also visit. Here he would debate his belief that it was possible to reform the monarchy from within, and that rational mathematical laws could help create a fairer society. In fact, Condorcet believed that even booking a restaurant was subject to mathematical probability theory.
Alors, un restaurateur prend des réservations, il sait que beaucoup de réservations arriveront et un petit peu moins de gens viendront. Qui va consister à prendre un peu trop, à faire du surbooking, comme on dit aujourd'hui, en son temps, qui est le calcul des probabilités.
Probability theory also told Condorcet that the greater the number of people involved in a decision, the better it would be. This belief in representative government was a direct attack on absolute monarchy.
La jeune aristocratie française considère que non, il n'est pas possible de transformer ce pays par en haut, il faut le faire par en bas, par l'opinion publique, par la diffusion des idées, etc.
The Enlightenment thinkers who gathered at Le Procope knew that the people of Paris were becoming increasingly angry. Here at the French National Archives is evidence of their growing frustration at Louis XVI's failings.
Finally, the king ran out of money. He knew that there was nothing he could do unless he consulted his people and got their cooperation in changing things. But to do that, he had to ask them what their grievances were. And traditionally, when that happened, people were allowed to draw up cahiers, which are lists of grievances for his consideration. And this is one typical one. This is a cahier of Paris. And in it you see a whole range of issues which are brought up. There were 50,000 of these drawn up all over the country.
The king had got more than he bargained for. Volume after volume of grievances, complaints and demands, most of which he couldn't or wouldn't fulfill. What had been planned as a consultation exercise to extract more taxes began to backfire on him badly.
The range of grievances was enormous, but what came out was that everybody expected some sort of constitution, everybody expected some sort of equality in taxation, everybody expected some diminution of the privileges of the nobility.
When the king failed to respond to any of these demands, for constitutional reform, for the kind of equality in taxation that Condorcet demanded, for some sign that the king understood the suffering of his people, their patience ran out. In Paris on July the 14th, 1789, they erupted onto the streets, destroying the Bastille, the royal prison, and releasing its inmates. The revolution had begun. Condorcet was jubilant, but also worried that with no political experience, people could be carried away by their pent-up anger, that France could be on the brink of anarchy. So he began to write articles and publish journals and have them distributed in the streets. He believed that with the right information and the right ideas, moderation could still prevail.
C'est pour ça qu'il va passer, dès que la liberté de la presse va être accordée, beaucoup de temps à publier tous les jours des articles dans la presse pour informer ceux qui vont agir, ceux qui participeront à tous ces mouvements révolutionnaires, pour comprendre comment agir politiquement selon la raison. Il va créer un journal d'instruction sociale, aussi un journal de la Société de 1789, pour former politiquement les citoyens au cours même du processus révolutionnaire. Donc ces ouvrages serviront dans son esprit à éviter que le citoyen se trompe dans son jugement politique.
Condorcet was taking advantage of the relaxation of censorship in France. For the first time, he and others could write and print what they liked.
Il faut bien dire que c'est une expérience nouvelle pour l'humanité que de découvrir une période révolutionnaire avec la liberté de ce qu'on appelle aujourd'hui l'information.
But Condorcet knew that information alone was not enough. People needed a blueprint of their basic rights, like America had, a statement of the rights and freedoms of citizens on which to base a new social system. He set about writing one and getting it distributed.
Ce projet, il l'écrit comme un savant, c'est-à-dire de manière très analytique. Les principes sont posés très clairement. Cette déclaration des droits, ces principes qui sont exposés ici en 5 points, à la sûreté de la personne, à la liberté de la personne, à la sûreté des biens, à la liberté des biens, à l'égalité naturelle, tels sont les droits naturels pour Condorcet.
Condorcet's simple principles became part of an even more famous text. A text so precious today that it's kept behind 6 locked doors. It was drawn up at the request of the people's representatives in the Legislative Assembly, the Estates General, and put their ideas into simple but powerful words. The hopes and dreams of the Enlightenment were finally enshrined in law.
This is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. It's the founding manifesto of the French Revolution. Inspired originally by America, and Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, advised on the drawing up of this document. It was designed to be the preamble to the new Constitution of France. So the 2 things it enshrines are liberty and equality. Liberty meaning no taxation without representation, meaning representative government, meaning freedom of thought and expression. Equality meaning equality of rights, equality before the law, equality of opportunity, equality before the taxman. These are fundamental elements bequeathed by the Enlightenment, and they've become the ancestors of all subsequent declarations of human rights.
The Declaration distilled a century of Enlightenment thinking. It told all men that they had rights they were born with, that they were free and equal, and no one could tell them otherwise. Emboldened by the Declaration and frustrated by the slowness of the king's response to it, the people decided to take action again, this time by marching on Versailles.
Over the summer of 1789, the people of Paris began to lose faith in the king. They no longer thought, as they had at the beginning of the year, that he was on their side. The beginning of October, the women of Paris marched to Versailles. They took the king and queen prisoner, in effect, and demanded that they go back to Paris with them.
The people could hardly believe they now had the king at their mercy. But what to do with him was hotly debated. For some revolutionaries, imprisonment wasn't enough. They demanded his head. Condorcet had been recently elected Deputy President of the National Assembly, the French Parliament. He was closely involved in deciding the king's fate.
Quand l'Assemblée juge le roi, il vote pour la culpabilité du roi. Pour lui, il n'y a pas de doute, le roi a trahi, il est coupable, mais il vote contre l'application de la peine de mort. Il considère qu'il faut appliquer la peine la plus dure que le code pénal ait prévue, sauf la peine de mort, parce que, dit-il, il est contre le principe. Cette position assez sophistiquée dans le contexte politique de l'époque n'a pas été très bien comprise ni par les monarchistes, ni par les révolutionnaires.
For Condorcet, the mathematician, guilt could never be proved 100%. The death penalty was sometimes bound to take innocent lives and was therefore wrong. This document recorded his vote against, a decision based on logic. But Condorcet was outvoted, and the deputies in the National Assembly decided to execute the king. He was to be among the first victims of the guillotine. This new rational technology remained in use until 1977. It was supposedly painless and could process its many victims much more quickly than other methods. Most people were overjoyed at the king's execution. But in the political power vacuum that followed, different factions began to turn on each other. Thousands were arrested and executed in a bloodbath called the Terror. Condorcet's worst fears of chaos and anarchy had come true.
In the course of the next 12 months, something like 16,000 death sentences were passed. The vast majority of the people who were killed were just ordinary people who had got on the wrong side either of laws or who had enemies who were prepared to denounce them for grievances that often went far back into the 18th century. This was the opportunity. Someone once said the Terror was everyone's revenge.
Soon it was Condorcet's turn to become a victim. In 1794, he was thrown out of office for having opposed the king's execution. A warrant was issued for his arrest. He hid here, a tiny top-floor flat in a Parisian house.
Ici même, dans ces pièces, Condorcet a vécu les derniers mois de sa vie, dans une période d'anxiété très grande. Il craignait d'être arrêté, il était proscrit, il craignait aussi pour la vie de sa femme, de sa fille. D'ailleurs, il s'est entendu avec sa femme pour divorcer, de telle sorte qu'elle soit protégée, parce qu'elle risquait d'être arrêtée elle-même du fait qu'il était lui-même proscrit.
Amid the terror that was consuming French society, Condorcet wrote a final testament to his belief in Enlightenment ideas. It was called The Outline of the Progress of the Human Spirit.
C'est un ouvrage prouvé définitivement dans son esprit que l'humanité, donc seule sur Terre, gagne en perfectibilité, malgré des hauts, malgré des bas, malgré des ennemis, malgré des difficultés, mais accumule parce qu'il y a l'imprimerie, parce qu'il y a les scientifiques, parce qu'il y a l'activité morale qui se développe, le progrès s'accumule et il veut le démontrer.
Among his last words were these: "The time will come when the sun will shine only on free men, who know no other master but their reason." He was tracked down, arrested, and died in prison. His body was never found. 2 centuries after the French Revolution, Condorcet's empty tomb now stands here in the Pantheon, France's memorial to its greatest men and women. Condorcet wanted the Enlightenment to change society in profound and beneficial ways. He believed this could be done rationally and scientifically. In the mayhem of the revolution, reason and logic were swept aside. And he paid with his life. But his vision of equality, justice, and the power of knowledge lives on. We owe the world we live in today, in great part, to the Enlightenment. Representative government, freedom, equality, and human rights. These are all Enlightenment ideas that people have fought for since the 17th century. The importance of education has come to be widely accepted, that every child has the right to find out for itself about the world. It also gave us the belief that through shared knowledge, society can continue to progress. But today, these ideas, and the discoveries of science itself, are under attack as growing religious fundamentalism and superstition threaten to drag us back into the past. By enabling children to understand the achievements of the Enlightenment, we can help to protect and expand its legacy. Each new generation is our hope for the future.